Okay, welcome to the third video of Reading the Docs. I'm Dan, and I'm here with Connor.
Yeah, really excited.
And today we're going to be doing using the state hook.
So it looks like here in this example, right? They keep some state variables count, and there's there's this set count, which I guess is probably something that we would be able to use to be able to change that count in the store. And it says use state with 0 as a parameter. So let's look at the equivalent class example. So 0 is definitely the initial state that we want our count to be. So in this example here, right, they would sort of like set the state in the constructor, or
We got our super props there.
yeah, this would be an example where you don't have maybe some of the newer Babel transforms where you could set state on the class directly. But yep, it's got some initial state, and then you got your set state here, where you would say count is this dot state dot count plus 1 if you want to increment. Kind of interesting. It seems like in this one here, right, set state sort of allows you to change everything about the state, and it seems like above we had set count. If you go back up to here, it says set count is count plus 1. We actually have like a full mutation method given to us by the store for just that one property, which is kind of cool. It seems like every sort of root part of the state, maybe we're getting like a mutation, like a mutator method, right?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So we're not actually defining set count anywhere. It's actually giving us a function to update a value, and we have to just send in the new value. That's kind of weird, because what I want to do is say like, oh, where's set count, so that I can go and look at how that works. But it's not actually a thing. It's just a sort of generic function that gets returned. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, I like it, because I don't know, I've written like a fair amount of Java when I first started writing, right? Like the first thing I would do is because everything was private, like having to get all this stuff out, I would have to write like a function to change something about what was inside of my private class. And here it just like it looks like it kind of gives that to you. So that's
Aren't we
nice.
supposed to use the function version of set state when we're using previous state?
Yeah, I think that does seem about right.
They might just be kind of overlooking that here because it's such a simple app, I guess.
Yeah.
Because theoretically, something else could be updating this count behind the scenes, and
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, in this case, right, it seems like a pretty simple app. So
Yeah.
only one thing really changing state at a time.
It's funny how a lot of these conventions, I've actually noticed that people at Facebook or the actual creators of React are like, yeah, they're kind of conventions, but they're kind of loose conventions, It's like, if you know what you're doing and you know how it works and you want to disobey the convention, then like, yeah, just go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like a
Interesting.
recurring theme, right? Like, they're not tied to convention. I think, I know a lot of people definitely really like to, make all your code follow a certain pattern,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But,
And I think general recommendations are good, especially in a large code base with a bunch of people working on it.
yeah, and people who might not be familiar with the code base, like having an established pattern is helpful, but, like it's not wrong if they didn't choose to follow
Right.
the pattern.
The patterns are only as useful as your ability to understand when to use them and when not to.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. So it looks like, as a reminder, function components in React look like this or this. So, they sort of show that you could write function components as either an arrow function or just your regular function. Sort of the benefit of the arrow function, I think, being that, this will be bound, as opposed to having to bind it onto the function.
Right.
whatever you
It
call
binds at a lex time versus at parse time or whatever.
Yeah, I'm not really so sure what benefit there is one over the other. I see a lot of people writing these arrow functions.
Yeah, if you're not using the this keyword, it doesn't matter that much. The one time, so I went through this mental experiment of saying like, all right, now the arrow functions are out. I'm only ever going to use arrow function. It doesn't make sense to ever use a function, declaration versus expression.
Right.
I'm always going to use function expression. I'm always going to use arrow function because I like the syntax. It's kind of fancy. I can leave out these little parens if I want on the props.
Right.
I can do an auto return. Like it's feels a lot nicer. But then I went to I think it was a file in Redux or somewhere, and in like a really well-respected library, and I saw a regular function, and I was like, oh, why would they do this? And it's because they wanted the code order, the order of the functions in the code to make sense, and they were using a function above where it was declared, which means you have to use a function so it gets hoisted, because these guys don't get hoisted because it's a const.
Yep.
So that's one case where it was like, oh, okay, like they had to use this so that it would get hoisted and they could keep their functions in the order they wanted in that code file.
Interesting. I think the key takeaway here, for sure, is sort of what they're talking about here, is that like previously, if you read in the React docs, they would refer to these as sort of stateless components.
Mm-hmm.
And so now that there is state in this example, right, inside of these components, they're not really stateless anymore. So they're going to start changing the nomenclature to be function components. I've also heard it referred to as functional components.
Yeah, that's a little strange to call it functional, just because functional is such an overloaded term.
Yeah.
Function components, I think, makes a lot of sense. But yeah, I've heard that too. I've heard functional.
So it seems like function components is the preferred name if you're going to refer to these, and hooks are really only for these function components. They're not going to end up working if you put them inside of a class.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. They don't work inside of classes. I hadn't actually thought of that.
I guess it makes sense, right? Like
yeah.
So interesting. So right, what was happening in that first example is kind of, we touched on a little bit of it, but it's kind of hard to see. I think they sort of break it down here. So this probably was talked a little bit about in the first two sections, but right, what's a hook, right? The hook gives us the ability to hook into this sort of like React magic, or the React features that you get in a regular class component. So useState allows us to use the state concept with our functional components. And why might you want to use a hook rather than converting to a state component? Well, or a class component rather. Right now, I actually have a plugin in my machine that converts a functional component or a function component to a class, a full-on class, because like it's such a pain to go in and change. Like,
yeah, you're like, oh, I need state now. Let me have to like go and refactor my entire function, put it in the render, add the parens and the curlies.
Props goes from props to this dot props. It's just like it takes a lot of time. Whereas now you just be like, oh hey, so this component needs to rely on state. This is just something that it handles now. And it looks like you're talking about some special rules about when you can and can't use hooks. Seems like we'll probably get to that. I really want
to click on that. But
yeah, it sounds like a further.
We will not get
section.
Distracted.
So declaring a state variable. So in our old example, we have this constructor, and you would just set this dot state to an object, and it is initialized with count as
super props, man. That
0.
kills me.
Yeah.
Kills me. If anything to get rid of classes, it's to get rid of super props.
Yeah, totally. I mean, in all this sort of look at how many lines of code are written here to just like initialize the data. Kind of crazy. And the next one even looks like there's a lot of lines of code, but when you look at its import React, that's going to be in the other one as well.
Yeah.
So you've got your example function component, right? And so there's going to be no this, because obviously our function is not a class. So we're not setting state to a property on that class. Instead, it just sort of becomes a variable that's in scope every time the function is run. What's happening here, right? We talked about like this is kind of weird that we have this sort of like it looks sort of like destructuring, and then we've got this use state 0.
Yeah, this is array destructuring, which I was chatting with Raf earlier about why they might use arrays instead of objects. It seems kind of weird. Like with an object, you could do give it some named thing that makes sense, that it would be easier to understand the API. But it's interesting because Reason ML also converts everything to arrays. It doesn't use objects at all in the compiled JavaScript output, like buckle script.
Interesting.
So I think there's a reason in the compiler to like say arrays are like more efficient if you can use them, and why not? It's kind of a tuple syntax thing that functional programmers are used to.
Interesting. Yeah, I feel like I'm into the idea. Just haven't used it a lot.
Yeah.
Right. So when we use state, when we call use state, we're declaring a state variable, and it looks like here, right, if we're using array destructuring, state might not actually know like what this thing is. It just knows that it has to maintain a particular variable that we alias is called count. Right, we could call it anything else, and
call it banana.
Yeah, I could call it banana, and basically you have to preserve some values between function calls. Right, every time you want each function to know, like, was I open? Was I not open? Did my color change from red to green? Every time I render, I don't, like, how am I going to figure that out? This sort of allows us to persist that information between the lifecycle of this function, which literally just runs, right?
Right. So this is actually really interesting, because normally any variable you're declaring inside your function, when your function runs again, it's going to redeclare these variables.
Yeah, and something, Dan, it was really interesting about that. Someone asked me, like, do function components, when do function components render?
Yeah.
It's every time.
Yeah. Because they run every single time. It's just a function. It just gets called.
Yep.
So then to preserve this value, this use state has to be like registering this somewhere, right? And then when the function runs, is it actually giving it? It's probably like caching it somewhere inside of React, and then it's just when this runs, it's returning it. It's running this use state every single time our function runs. Am I getting this right? And then it just returns the cached value.
Yeah.
The first time it creates it, and then every subsequent time it returns like the cached value.
Yep. And I'm sort of wondering too, if you were to use two pieces of state, would it, like, how would you tell React, that you want to have which is which, right? I'm not sure that React is actually keeping track of what the key of it is.
Yeah.
But let's see what it says here.
Yeah, maybe it'll tell us.
So what does calling state do? Right, we're creating a state variable, and then when we pass in as an argument, the argument for use state is going to be the initial state. So we talked about that earlier. It's going to be 0. And unlike with classes, the state doesn't actually have to be an object, because when you think about the state before, right, we would hang off all these little properties on the state. What we're doing each time we're using state here is we're actually these keys that we're giving, like count, is just, it's one of those properties that would end up being on the object. So there's no need for there to be the whole object that you're initializing at the beginning.
But you could do that, right? You could send an object in.
Yep.
And say that your value is going to be like some giant like store, and then you could update that store by like changing the object. But that seems like counter to what they're suggesting here, is that you keep everything separate.
I mean, an example of this might be I don't know, maybe like currently selected option might be something where it has like both an ID as well as a string that describes it or something.
But you wouldn't want like one giant object and only use one use state.
Yeah, no.
If you have a bunch of different things.
This could definitely, you could end up sort of tying some spaghetti here that you didn't mean to if you started to write a big object here and sort of use it the old way. I think, right, every single property, you want to denote those separately in the new state.
Which is probably because you don't want to call the same set state thing for all of your different calls. You want to like separate out the different parts of your apps so that you could actually pull that the way that you update that data into a separate function or separate file or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I guess the question that sort of we're wondering about is like, what does useState return, right? So it returns a pair of values, the current state and the function that updates it. And this is why we write this sort of array destructuring. It's similar to this. So we would destructure these values. Count would be the equivalent of this.state.count. And set count would be the equivalent of this.setState, where we would have to say which part of the state that you want to change. And so you get these as a pair. And so it looks like we're going to come back to that at the bottom.
Cool.
So now that we know what it does, our example obviously makes a little more sense. And why would we be using useState, and why would it not be called createState? Well, I think it gets back to that thing we were talking about before, where functions run every time. So the first time we render, we are going to be creating the state, right?
Yes.
But every subsequent time, we're going to be relying on the cache from React. So it wouldn't really be creating the state. It would probably just be using it. So it looks like for them, they always talk about all these hooks as starting with use as opposed to create, because it's technically only create for the very first time that the function is put onto the page.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's also a thing where you like have to call it use, right?
Yep.
Which is,
I mean, it could be called create or use, but then naming is hard.
Naming is weird. Okay.
So, right, if we were to render this thing, before we would say this.state.count, but now since we've got it in the scope of our function,
just
use count. I think that's
nice.
Kind of nice. We oftentimes, people will say, "Oh, why don't you destructure this.state?" It's like,
yeah.
You don't even have to do that.
No, you don't need to. Yeah.
It just comes this way. Updating state becomes a little nicer, right? Instead of having to call this.state and specify which property you want to update, you just say, "I've got this mutation method, set count. I'm going to call it."
Yeah, and you don't have to worry about, do I use the functional version? Do I use the other? No, it's just a function. Just use it.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
So, quick little recap. So, first thing you got to do, and I don't think actually we talked about this, but the first thing you have to do is you actually have to import useState as a named export from React.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting.
That's where it comes from. It's not like Jest, where you might have configured your environment for it to just be a global, or fragments, which might be configured, right? useState, you have to import it as a named export from React.
And you guys really go in depth on this one example, huh?
Oh, wow. Yeah. They really want to make sure you understand it. Right, so we talked about this destructuring.
Yeah.
And then when you want to actually mutate something, right, you would call set count directly as opposed to calling
Now, do you have to provide the initial value? Did we go over that?
Yeah, so the initial value you have to provide, right, as a parameter to useState. So in this case, it's 0, but maybe if we were saying color, right, it would be blue, the string blue.
Right. But what would happen? So, two questions on that, and maybe they go into this. They do kind of go into this.
What if you don't give it?
What if you don't give it? And what if you give it a number first, and then you set count to banana? Does it just do the old JavaScript thing of just work? Or does it say like, hey, JavaScript is not typed, so I assume it's just going to be like, all right, cool. Now your count is a banana.
Yeah, I would assume that it would probably be okay with that. I think if you were using a strictly typed language, or strict typing like maybe flow type or right, like what you would do is define exactly what signature you want that to be. So you say that it could be a number or a string. But I think you kind of
It's interesting. I haven't looked at like TypeScript or Flow with hooks, and how that might be able to. I assume it would just be able to like progressively integrate, and you'd be able to do stuff. Yeah, I don't know.
I hope so. I mean, I think state is something that's important to be typed, right?
Yeah.
You want to make sure that the contract is pretty obvious.
Yeah, because if somebody accidentally calls your function with the wrong type, that'd be nice to know.
Yeah. So let's go down to this, what do square brackets mean? I think we talked about this bit here. So the JavaScript syntax is called array destructuring. which means that we're creating two new variables: fruit, which is our value, and setFruit, which is a function. It's equivalent to the code here, where essentially, right, the return value is an array with two things in it, and you say thing at index 0, thing at index 1.
So we could actually just not destructure this, and we could call this use banana state, and then later we could reference use banana state.fruit, and then use banana state.setFruit.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
But this is obviously seems a lot nicer.
Yeah. And then, oh wow, hey, look, they touch on it at the bottom.
Oh wait, no, I just said something completely incorrect, because that would assume that this is an object that has like use banana state. What it would actually be is like you would set this to a use state array, and then you reference index 0 for the value and index 1 for the function to update it, right?
Yeah.
Which would be way worse.
Well, yeah, that wouldn't be great.
Because who knows what 0 and 1 mean?
Right. Well, I mean, only your React developer. Right?
Yeah.
So, interesting.
Oh, that's what they just did. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Okay.
But they call it fruit state variable, which is even more confusing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is explaining just array destructuring. What they use var here? Come on.
I mean,
they're like they want to make it clear that this is not the right way to do it. They're like, in the 90s we would have done it like this.
So the tip here for using multiple state variables, I mean, we were talking about this earlier, like, hey, what about your functions or your components, but maybe mine might have two things we want to keep track of here.
Yep.
It seems like, my suspicion was right. You would basically call useState a number of times. And so, right, like, it seems like because the function will always be calling useState in the same order, that it's okay that it doesn't need to know what key it is. But
it must keep track of the... No, how would it do that?
I don't think that it does. I think that it's purely because of the order in which these things are called, right? So age, fruit, and to-dos, it only knows that there are three separate things it's keeping in state. It does not know what they are called because we are assigning it the value when we destructure it.
But how does it know we're in this function?
That's a really good question. I'm not too certain.
Like if you're getting called, if you're making a function that gets called in a scope, can you reference the outer scope name?
I think you can.
So maybe they're doing that and like keying that.
I'd be really interested to see.
No, but then you could have multiple functions in different areas of your code base that have the same name.
Maybe naming becomes important. I don't know.
There's no way, because you could have even many versions of this component in your in the same page, and it would have to keep track of the state of each component differently.
Right. Well, I mean, but we do know that we can compare the function that we're looking at, right? So we can compare this to a previous one, and know that they're equal, right? So
the function scope.
Well, the function itself, right? So if we know that the component that we're calling is called example with many states, and then we call it again, we can know that, hey, these two things are the same component that we're asking for. They probably map to this sort of state cache that we're keeping somewhere in React.
Yeah, maybe they'll get into this more in depth later, or I might just have to look it up.
Yeah,
I might have to read some code. Isn't there? I think somebody did a tutorial where they implemented hooks.
Yeah, I would definitely be interested to see how that works. Because it probably isn't magic. It probably is something very straightforward.
Oh yeah, for sure. There's a way. I just can't think of the elegant solution right now.
Yeah, I can't either. But it seems like in this example, right? So the order does matter, right? So if I choose age, fruit, and to-dos, right, those things will be kept as state. I guess I would be really careful not to conditionally import your state just in case that order really does matter.
Oh right. Oh yeah. I think in fact you can't have use hooks in any sort of a conditional or loop because of the way it has to keep track of it.
Yeah, so you should just do that at the top of all your functions probably.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty obvious what the state is that you're using.
Mm-hmm.
So they're all local variables, and we can update them individually. Right, but so it's interesting, right? Like if something were to change, right? And maybe I want to update the fruit and the age. So now the apple is 12 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Do I have to set fruit and set age like in two
Yeah,
separate...
you'd have to call both of them in one function, right? Or you could make another function that just
calls both of them?
Yeah, it calls both. Just compose, not composing, but...
But the interesting thing about set state, right, is that you give it an object, and you can change whatever portion of the state that you want. And so you can change multiple keys. In this case, it seems like there's the state is going to get updated twice. Now, whether or not React's going to call the component to render it twice is probably not necessarily true, because we know in our regular class components, right, if you were to call set state twice, it's not necessarily React's not necessarily going to re-render the component, because it's going to like set up a queue of all of the set states, and then sort of whatever finally decides that the state is, it's going to then go ahead and render.
Yeah, it's going to resolve all that first.
So maybe we rely on the same mechanism here.
Yeah, but then I don't know actually, but then you would think you'd have the same problem of if it's like semi-asynchronous C, then you'd have to have two different ways of setting state, one that relies on previous state and one that does not. But we only have one way here.
Right.
So I don't know. Another good question. We'll have to tweet.
Yeah, we should.
Abramov or somebody.
We should tweet him. Yeah, see what he says.
People are pretty responsive on Twitter about React, the creators. So we could actually do that.
Yeah. So I think the bit here that's super important, which I'm surprised that it doesn't like. It doesn't highlight this out. It just sort of buried it a little bit. Is that it says you don't have to use many state variables. They can hold objects and arrays just fine. So yeah, if you want to write a big object, you could.
Sure.
But unlike this .setState in the class, updating a state variable always replaces it instead of merging it.
Okay.
So right in the setState example, right, we would probably you could like mention just one key, and it would merge that key, and if you only had a few props inside of there, right?
Yep.
If for example, fruits were an object and the object had color and smell and something else, right? And you updated smell only, right?
Or is radioactive.
Is radioactive.
Bananas. Or is almost extinct. Did you hear that bacteria or whatever got to South America now, and all our bananas are about to go away?
That's rough.
Although I think they CRISPR GM'd a resistant version in Australia, so maybe we'll get our bananas from Australia. So
I want some fortified bananas, personally.
Oh yeah, fortified, that'd be nice.
So is radioactive? Say if you were just to change that key,
yes,
it wouldn't remove all the other properties. But in the case where you have like a big object, you actually have to take the existing state, clone it on, and give all of the other keys, because otherwise, if you were just set is radioactive to true, it would literally replace the whole banana object, and it wouldn't have any of those other keys on there.
Yeah. So you'd have to like do the thing where you spread. In this case, like to-dos. You could spread to-dos and then add the next one, or you'd have to push. No, how would you do that? You could push something. So is this an array?
I mean, you could. I mean, there's nothing saying in here that you couldn't. The thing about to-dos, right? There's nothing that's saying that you couldn't change like any part of to-dos.
This would be like. So if I wanted to add a to-do, I could do like. Can I push onto to-dos and then set to-dos? You know what I mean? Yeah.
So the thing with set to-dos, right, is that if you want to set like a new... Oh, interesting.
Would this work? And then... Like in like some function somewhere. I don't know.
Well, but I think the bit that they're getting at here is that you what you're getting out of the store is a reference, right? So to-dos will be a reference to the original. And so if you were to set, right,
This is
set
the
to-dos,
other way I can think of doing it.
that would definitely work.
Okay.
But the first one, you would only work if you then, I think, set to-dos with the new to-dos. And I'm not clear.
Because it's going to be the same reference.
Yeah, and I'm not clear that that's not going to then mutate
That.
what's. Yeah, that would be. Well, but even
Probably
just
the equivalent.
even the where you say to-dos.push, I think
Yeah.
because you're mutating, I don't know if that to-dos is going to be a copy of the original or it's actually going to be the original. So that I'm not sure that you wouldn't actually be mutating what was in the store.
Oh, interesting. So this might maybe React would throw an error then.
Yeah, it might. Let's.
Interesting.
I'm curious to see. Maybe we can do some
we try it?
examples. Yeah, try it out.
All right. That should be easy. Let's see. Code sandbox. Are we done with this? Did
I think
we
we're
read
done.
everything?
Let's just hit the next steps real quick.
Next steps. On this page, we learn thing. We call the thing. Sometimes we're going to refer to as the state hook. Wait, the state hook or just state hook? All right, whatever. Let's add blah we did for the first time ever. Yay! We also learned a little bit more about hooks. So now we can go through our entire code base and just replace everything that was a stateful class with. No, we already got warned that we shouldn't do that. Okay.
And
Learn about what hooks, these are functions into the name start with use. Let's continue with the use effect. Oh, I can't wait for the use effect, but
me neither.
I will because we gotta figure this out. Okay. Sandbox. Give me a React one.
And so I think it's going to be important we do at least React 16.8.
Is it gonna? Yeah, we got 16.8.6 in here, so we should be good.
Sweet. Oh, look. Hey, look. Here's a function component.
Oh, so I can just add my.
Yeah, you can remove line.
Let's take this and just put it up there. Let's take this and put it down here. And then let's take this and get rid of that and put that there. Is there a format thing in here? Format? No. Okay.
So,
Save formats it.
so if you were to click me,
And it forks it.
hey, look, we got some like state each time that function's going to be called, but it's going to sort of cache that, which is nice.
Cool. So now, what do we want to try? The array thing.
So let's try an object, or rather just
Just
a
an
regular
object?
Yes, a plain old object.
Okay.
And let's set
Greeting.
hello and location of world or something.
Object. Set. Location.
Yeah, location world.
Cool. And then we'll do like greeting dot. Should we just structure that off? Can we do that?
Oh yeah, totally could.
Ah, interesting. Object. Okay, and then we could say that
Comma.
that. Okay, we're doing it. And then on click, we'll set something. We'll just say it'll kill it. Okay, so we have hello world, and that kills it. Cool.
Right, and the problem right here is that when you're destructuring our greeting and location, those are going to be undefined. Right.
Right.
So let's set greeting to let's just set when you set the greeting to hello or salutations or something.
I'm gonna put this in this and
Yeah,
do this so we have some space. Okay.
that's a lot more legible.
Wait, what is this? I need a double. Yield double. Okay.
So in our object here, we're going to set greeting
The old one.
Let's just do like a regular. Let's just see what they're talking about, right? So greeting. If you say salutations, what you'll see what happens is, right, because we have an object, it's just going to say salutations and
then it kills the other property, right?
Right, which is like a little dangerous.
We didn't spread it in.
So
now let's try mutating.
Yep.
Dot equals blarp. Is this big enough? Cool. Okay, and then so if we don't spread in here.
Yep.
Oh God, did the world blow up? It's not doing anything because it's not doing anything because the reference didn't change.
Yeah, and so that's like one of the things about React, right? Is it is never going to re-render if something is shallowly equal to itself.
Right.
And if you mutate the original objects inside of React, it's going to look at it and say, hey, well, you said it was salutations.
Yeah.
So.
At the top level,
Yeah.
It still didn't change. So you have to actually, okay, but this actually works. So this spreading in after mutating works.
Because we're creating a new reference to an object.
Yeah.
Also not very cool to do it this way.
Because you can't save, we don't know what the old greeting was now.
Exactly.
Which I don't know if we'd ever get back to that, but maybe some like debug tools in the future would be like, let me keep track of all of the previous states. So the best way to do this would probably be to
just take the original greeting
the same
objects.
way you do in a Redux thing, right? Yeah.
Yep.
And then
yeah, I would kind of, if you've worked in Redux before, I would probably treat these hooks very similarly to how you would treat a Redux store. Where it's just it's a store that you're putting your information, and you don't want to mutate the store directly. You could probably use something like seamless immutable or mutables to handle making sure that you explicitly don't do that. But I mean, the patterns are pretty well defined, right?
Yeah. But you know what I'm seeing now? We had to do this extra thing. We have to do this extra thing every time. We have to remember what the original was. This is why they say just put it in a separate thing. Should we see what it looks like with separate?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it would be a lot simpler to just have.
So if we do, instead of this, we do const. We'll say greeting set. Oh yeah, because then it's just going to be separate.
Yeah, I think this is. And then you just say hello as your initial.
And then something very similar for location. And then that stays the same. And then here we don't have to do this. We just say set greeting with our new greeting.
God, that's so much simpler.
So much better. We're not calling set location, but that's fine.
And I mean, to that point, I think, great, that's an optional argument, because if you're not going to use it, if you're only ever going to reference it, I mean, one, does it belong in state? But two, you don't have to always destructure both if you don't want to.
Yeah.
Cool.
Very nice.
This makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, except for I'm still wondering like how it keeps track every time it runs. I think there's a video on this. I think there's a video from a recent conference, maybe it was React Rally, where somebody from the community or the React team implemented hooks live coding during the talk, and it was really good but also really confusing.
Cool.
All right. I think this is it for this one, and we'll do use effect next time.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan.